Most people realise that bayonets were used extensively in World War I and not always in the ways that you might imagine. But what's not commonly realised is that swords actually saw quite a lot of use in the Great War also. And in uncovering some research behind this very sword here, which was carried in World War I found a fascinating story about the person who owned this, but also about unexpected use of swords in World War I. Hi folks, Matt Easton here and you're on Schola Gladiatoria channel, but I also work for Easton Antique Arms, my antiques business. Now, I was in the process of cleaning up this beautiful Wilkinson 1896 pattern cavalry officer's sword. This was purchased from Wilkinson in 1907 and I am in the process of giving it a bit of a clean up and a bit of restoration. It was covered in some degree of rust when it came to me and I'm gradually bringing it back to a sympathetic, conserved kind of condition, not fully restored, not shiny, not removing patina, so to speak, but getting rid of the active rust, cleaning it up. Now, Wilkinson swords, for any regular viewers of my channel, will probably know this by now, but there is a serial number down here. Now, there are no identifying names or initials or family crests or anything like that on this sword, so I'm only dependent on that serial number. Now, luckily, Wilkinson, amongst all the different companies making swords, Wilkinson were the most prestigious and the most established, and were still going until the early 2000s, when unfortunately they closed, for making swords anyway. They still make razor blades and things like that. And the records still survive. Because they kept going as a company, their records survived all the way through to the early 21st century, in fact still survive today. The records are kept in the Royal Armouries in the UK, but various other people made copies of them as well. Anyway, you can get to the records. Now, the records don't always show if a sword was sold to a named person. Sometimes they were sold to shops, to outfitters, to people, shops where officers went to buy their gear. But in this case, luckily, there was a name on it, and it told me who the purchaser of this sword was. Now, that was interesting because it was purchased in 1907, but the blade, which is very evident when I'm restoring such a thing, is service sharpened. So swords like this were sold very slightly blunt, and they were given their final sharpen when active service was declared. So in other words, when war was declared. And one of the last times in British history, and actually in European history in general, when swords and bayonets and things like cutlasses and lances were sharpened, the order was given to sharpen them, was in 1914 at the beginning of the Great War. Now, everybody thinks of the Great War these days as tanks and planes and trenches and these sort of famous iconic massive battleships, these iconic features of World War I, even, Zeppelins, airships. But what most people forget, most normal people, I hope people watching this channel are more educated by this point, but most common people don't think about World War I was started with people perceiving it as being like the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. So there'd be huge cavalry charges and all this kind of stuff. Lots more mobile artillery, and it would be less entrenched, essentially. And in fact, if we look at the war in the East, in Russia and Poland, areas over there, over to the East, and the Russian Revolution, of course, and then if we go down to North Africa and the Middle East with the Arab uprising against the Ottoman Empire, under T. Lawrence and the British Army and Indian Army's actions in the Holy Land, for example, in Israel, Palestine, then you will see that there was a lot more mobile warfare. There was the infantry and the cavalry acted in a much more mobile way, and there were a lot more cavalry actions. Anyway, just to say, so swords did see extensive use in World War I, which I know I keep saying on this channel, and I will keep saying it until it becomes more widespread information. But this sword is interesting because it was purchased in 1907. In fact, a new model came in 1912 for officers, but a lot of officers who already owned a sword, like this one purchased in 1907, didn't bother to update their sword. And so this sword was taken to World War I. How do I know? Because it's been service sharpened, and that is a pretty good sign. I also have the scabbard for it as well, which shows a lot of use and wear. And my estimation is this particular officer, who incidentally was a Lieutenant R.S.T. Moore of the 12th Lancers, the Lieutenant Moore couldn't have seen active service between 1907 and 1914 enough to give the wear and tear that there is to this sword and the service sharpening. So he must have taken this to war with him. Now, actually, he did see action pretty soon on. Now, first of all, what type of action did cavalry see in World War I? Well, a number of different actions, scouting actions, patrolling. In fact, the first British kill, supposedly, there's some debate about this, but the first British kill seems to have been with a cavalry officer's sword in 1914 on patrol when they bumped into a German patrol, also on horse. But also cavalry, as well as scouting and patrolling and doing typical cavalry things, they also operated as mobile infantry, and this was a very, very important role. Obviously, by World War I, rifles were highly accurate and very long range. Not many people had any sorts of optics or telescopic sights or anything like that, so people were still shooting with iron sights. So despite the fact a rifle could shoot 1,000 yards plus, shooting accurately with iron sights at 1,000 yards is incredibly difficult for anybody out there who shoots with iron sights. And I do shoot a World War I era 1916 dated SMLE, and I can tell you hitting anything at 1,000 yards, certainly a person, is very difficult. But especially in war conditions, even more so. But the fact is that in terms of volley fire, so shooting lots of bullets generally at where the enemy were, a lot of those bullets would hit things. So cavalry did sometimes manoeuvre quickly around the battlefield, deploy, in other words, dismount. They put their horses to the rear, a couple of 100 yards, apparently, as we'll find out here, and then they would deploy as infantry. So they would be riflemen. So they would get down behind a bush or behind a bank, or if there were trenches, get into a trench, and they would shoot at the enemy. And then when time came to either move to a different location to fire from a different position, or indeed to retreat, then they would get back to their horses, call up their horses quickly, get on their horses, they'd become cavalry again, and they'd ride off and redeploy somewhere else. This was a manner of fighting which the Boers had used very effectively in the Second Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1901-02. So, this type of mobile firing dragoon, essentially, so where cavalry dismounted to shoot, was incredibly prevalent, and that's what we see here. So anyway, when I found out that this belonged to an RST Moore of the 12th Lancers, in fact I knew it was 12th Lancers because it actually says on the blade up here, the Prince of Wales's Royal Lancers 12th Regiment up here on the blade. So I knew it was the 12th Lancers, but I didn't know which officer it was. But anyway, it was Lieutenant Moore of the 12th Lancers. Purchased in 1907, 1914 he was called up to action, and he went to war. And this is an interesting tale now, which I'm going to read off the document that I found on the screen, which shows an interesting use of a sword and a bayonet, and a rifle, in fact, separately. However, not this sword. So this sword, unfortunately, is not mentioned. And in this particular scenario, Lieutenant Moore, Captain Moore actually at that time, is on foot, with a rifle, and he doesn't have his sword with him. His sword almost certainly would have been attached to his horse, and he's not with his horse at the time. So the first source I'm going to read is some bad news followed by some good news. So this is from the Kildare Observer and Eastern Counties Advertiser. And this is on Monday evening last, the report that information had been received by Colonel St. Leger Moore, this is his father, who was a senior officer, companion of the Bath, Killashee, that his son, Lieutenant R.S.T. Moore, who owned that sword, the 12th Royal Lancers, was reported previously as having been killed in action on August the 25th, 1914. But actually was not killed, was wounded, and was in a French hospital. Right, we're going to find out more about that in a minute. Now, what's interesting is when you research a historical person like this, you can often immediately stumble across a record of them having been killed in action. And my first thought was that, oh, that's sad. This is a sword that belonged to an officer who commissioned in 1907. In 1914 went to France and very quickly was killed in action. And in fact, I have had a number of swords through my hands in my collection and also as a dealer that I've sold over the years, Where this was the case, a lot of officers who were prime targets for marksmen in 1914 died. So a lot of swords that particularly weren't in good condition because they weren't carried through a campaign, once the officer died, the belongings were sent back home. They were looked after lovingly by their family until at some point they got sold off or lost or whatever. So this sword was with his horse, as we're going to find out in a minute, but initially it looked like he'd been killed in action, and the newspapers reported that he had been killed in action, but actually he hadn't been. So yay, good news. Lieutenant Moore wasn't killed in action. So what happened to him? Well, amazingly, we actually have his own report of what happened next. So this is the report by Lieutenant R. Moore of the 12th Lancers of what happened next. On the 25th of August 1914, my regiment was in the rear of the 5th Cavalry Brigade, which for 2 days had been covering the infantry columns retiring from Mons towards Maubeuge. I don't know how to pronounce that. At about 6 p.m. that evening, I was ordered to take my troop to reinforce the other 3 troops of my squadron, which had become heavily engaged close to the small village of Mequinines, I think it is. There's a lot of places I can't pronounce the French for here, which allied on the Franco-Belgian frontier some 8 kilometres from Bavay. Just as I received my position in the firing line, so that's very important to explain the context there. So he is fighting as infantry. The horses have been taken elsewhere, but what the cavalry are doing, in this case the 5th Cavalry Brigade, is they're assisting partially in a retreat. So if the infantry have to move out, they can only do it on foot. The cavalry can get there quickly, they can keep firing while the infantry retreat to new lines, and then as the enemy, in this case the Germans, get closer, they can quickly get back on their horses and retreat. One of the absolute advantages of cavalry is they can retreat, they can get the hell out of there quicker than an enemy infantry can pursue them. Right, okay. So he just reached his position in the firing line when he received when I received, because it's his own report, when I received a bullet through the right ankle. Ouch! I can only imagine what it feels like to get a Mauser bullet through your right ankle. I imagine absolutely excruciating. Right. The troops on my left were ordered to retire, and I naturally had to hold on as long as possible to allow them to get back to their led horses some 200 yards in the rear. So the other cavalrymen finally were given the order, okay, it's okay to move off now, get back to your horses. The horses are 200 yards in the rear where they're hopefully out of, they're safe, probably behind embankments and things like this. Get back to the horses, make off, get the hell out of there. But he's been shot through the ankle. As I gave the order to retire, the enemy, who turned out to be a battalion of Jaegers, charged. And as I found I could not put any weight on my right foot, I emptied my revolver at the charging Germans at close range. Bam, 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 bam. So there he is with his probably Webley revolver, could be a Smith & Wesson, but most likely a Webley, emptying it into the charging Germans as best he can. So he is at this point, I imagine, thinking, I'm going to die, I'm going to take as many of the enemy with me as I possibly can. So a heroic last-ditch defence, fighting to the last. In consequence, I was very naturally, he's sympathetic to it, clubbed on the head with the butt of a rifle of the first German to reach me. Now that's interesting. Now I immediately thought, why would he have been clubbed on the head and not bayoneted? Well, there is an answer here that they are Jaegers and they are charging, and there's a clue later on we will find out they did not have their bayonets fitted. So bayonets were usually worn attached to the webbing belt at the side, and they would be pulled out and attached onto the rifle in order to give a charge. But for some reason, these charging Germans clearly didn't yet have their bayonets fitted. So naturally, when they got close enough to take out this British officer who was emptying his revolver at them, the first person to reach him smacked him in the head with their clubbed musket, or clubbed rifle in this case. When I recovered, I found that the Germans lying down were still firing at my squadron, who were retreating. So he'd been knocked unconscious. At my squadron, who on reaching their horses must have left a few men still firing in the hope that I or some of my troop could get back to them. When this firing ceased, the German soldiers took away my arms, weapons, and equipment, and my money. I mean, it's not surprising they take away his weapons, but interestingly, they took away his money. The latter, however, was returned to me by a German officer soon after with only 2 sovereigns short, only 2 sovereigns missing, which are not particularly high value coins. So interesting that the money was looted off him by the German soldiers, but as soon as a German officer turned up, he went, no, we don't do that, give it back to him. But some of it was missing. A German soldier then came up, and after a short harangue in which Schweinhund Engländer repeatedly recurred, he fixed his bayonet onto his rifle with the intention of killing me. But as he was on the point of doing so, a German officer, presumably a different German officer, appeared and, drawing his sword on the man, spoke a few words to him in German, whereupon the man saluted and moved off. So this is really, really interesting. So obviously this is against the regulations of war, the Articles of War. He was going to kill someone who essentially at this point was a prisoner of war. And I'm certain, on all sides in the war, that happened a lot, because dealing with prisoners takes up resources, takes up time, potentially even food and medical supplies and things like this. I would imagine that a lot of prisoners of war were on the spot executed. However, the officer, German officers, were known kind of internationally actually to be very well trained, very highly qualified on the most part, and played by the rules of war. And he did not let his private soldier execute at bayonet point this prisoner of war. A few other interesting things to note there. Firstly, again, this reiterates that the bayonet was not fitted to the rifle. That Jaeger wouldn't have needed to get his bayonet out to fit it onto his rifle if it was already on his rifle. And that again makes sense of why Lieutenant Moore was clubbed with a rifle instead of bayoneted, because they didn't have their bayonets fitted. But this is also interesting because a lot of people talk about, oh, well, during the war, most people obviously were killed with shelling or shot, shrapnel, this kind of stuff. Not many people were actually statistically killed with bayonets. And I have repeatedly made the point with evidence that actually, nevertheless, bayonets played an incredibly important part in World War I because they enabled soldiers to charge and take entrenchments at bayonet point and take prisoners and finish off people who'd already been shot or whatever, hit with a grenade, who were trying to still shoot or still a threat. So bayonets were used in a number of ways above and beyond just a primary weapon that were very, very important. Now, just a brief word about the sword. It is very likely that an officer of Jaegers carried one of these. So this is a German 1899 pattern Degen, as they call it. So it's a thrusting sword. It does have an edge, so it's got some cutting capacity, but it's basically a thrusting sword with the canted pistol-shaped grip there with Kaiser Wilhelm's monogram on the side. So this is the type of sword. And again, this shows swords used by infantry officers were not main weapons in World War I, but they still had an important role. First of all, this shows us that the German officer had a sword. Now, this is true up to about 1915, so it was normal for infantry officers to go into the trenches, into war, with a sword. It was found, as I've made a video about in the past, it was found that this made them, it was like waving a flag saying, I'm an officer, shoot me. And because it became so easy to spot the officers and shoot them first, they stopped carrying swords on all sides. But in the British Army, by the end of 1914, the officers had pretty much stopped carrying swords. And they took to carrying revolvers and swagger sticks, normally, or walking sticks. So, they put their swords away. However, in this case, this is a little bit earlier. This is August 1914. This German officer is still carrying his sword. But super interesting that it is not being used as a weapon per se. It is being used against a soldier, one of his own men, who is about to commit a war crime. And now this is hugely important to point out. Edged weapons, be they swords or bayonets, have repeatedly been used in World War I, World War II, even in the modern world, as a way of enforcing control amongst the men, the rank and file. You've got to bear in mind, in World War I there was mass conscription. The French army had a massive mutiny, revolution within the army at one point. The Indian army had a few wobbles as well during World War I. And, various other, during, in smaller cases in the British and German armies and Austrian and so forth. And obviously the Russian Revolution, and everybody was looking over their shoulders going, whoa, those Bolsheviks over there who've just beheaded all of their Tsars, we should keep an eye on that. Hence very strict gun regulation soon after the First World War in Britain, where they feared a Bolshevik revolution. That's a topic for another video. But nevertheless, the fact is the officers represent the ruling class, the men represent the working class for the most part, and so an officer having a sword is another way, a demonstration, a visible sign of keeping your men in check. And that's exactly what we see here happening in this source. And I have to obliquely mention that in the modern world, in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, bayonets have been used in modern history to control crowds. Not to stab people, but as a threat. And that is a documented thing. And, you know, bayonets, there are cases where if people hadn't had bayonets fitted, they probably would have been overwhelmed, hit with sticks, had their heads caved in with a brick, this kind of stuff. So even when the enemy isn't shooting at you, a bayonet can still be a useful weapon, or sword, of self-defense. Right, let's get back to this source here. But as he was on the point of doing so, going to stab me with a bayonet, a German officer appeared and, drawing his sword on the man, spoke a few words to him in German, whereupon the man saluted and moved off. The regiment then moved on at the double, leaving myself and some 10 wounded men of my troop in the hands of a doctor and some stretcher bearers. The dead, as I found out afterwards, were buried by the Germans, and the German dead close to the village. The doctor asked me certain questions, but did not seem in the least surprised or annoyed when I refused to answer them. He cut my boot off, and as the wound was not bleeding, presumably the bullet had passed straight through, he did not dress it, but dressed a slight wound in the forefinger of my right hand. My wounded men and myself were carried to a small deserted farmhouse close by, the windows of which were boarded up and the door locked. The door was broken open and we were laid on the floor of the room. The worst case was laid on a bed in the adjoining room. I asked a German for water to be left for us, and the doctor replied, "We have no water." Terrible German accent there. Only one of my men was bandaged, and this I do not put down to hostility or bad feeling on the part of my captors, but to the obvious hurry they were in to push on, as during the whole night troops kept marching past on the road close to the farmhouse. So this is a big German advance. I had no words with the stretcher bearers except to one man who said to me in English, "You are lucky to be alive," to which I thoroughly agreed. Having got all the wounded in, the stretcher bearers barricaded up the door of the house, and we were left from about 7 p.m. that evening until 10 a.m. the next morning. The rooms were of course quite dark, since the windows were stoutly boarded up and very hot. My men suffered greatly from thirst, and some of them in their delirium struggled to get up, making their wounds even worse. Unfortunately, I was the only one who could move about much, and even then only on all fours. And I did what I could to bandage them with my own field dressings. In addition to this, my head was extremely painful after having been clubbed, and my memory of the night is not very clear. One man I remember was dead in the morning, probably due to the loss of blood, as he was suffering great pain and was very restless. At about 10 next morning, 26th of August, some German soldiers with stretcher bearers and a doctor arrived, and we were carried out to the schoolhouse in the village and laid on the floor on clean straw. There we were dressed and fed by the French women of the village, and at about 3 p.m. the same day taken in a German horse ambulance to the French Red Cross hospital at Bavay. Right, and it obviously goes on, but essentially he became a prisoner of war. And in fact, if I now skip to another document here, it actually records that he was a prisoner of war, but returned home in 1917. So the happy story, the happy ending is he did get to return home, having initially been reported as dead, lost in action, then a prisoner of war, and he was a prisoner of war for a couple of years, all through 1915, 1916, and returned home in 1917. So he spent most of World War II as a prisoner of war. Anyway, so there we go. I will wrap it up there, but I think this is a great example of how researching an antique, a sword, can open up vast amounts of research. I mean, if I didn't have that serial number there, and if we didn't have the Wilkinson records, I wouldn't know any of this and I wouldn't be making this video with you now. So isn't that amazing that a chunk of rusty steel that I'm in the process of cleaning up to put on my website for sale at some point when it's ready, has opened up this line of research. It's revealed to us this veteran of the war who was a prisoner of war, who left a record about being a prisoner of war, and yet again gave us something to talk about the importance of edged weapons like swords and bayonets in World War I, and how they're often wrongly perceived their usefulness, and how even an officer's sword in the hand of a German officer played a part in saving the life of a British officer in 1914. Anyway, I hope that's been interesting. This will of course be part of my Storytime with Matt playlist. Check out the rest of that playlist if you haven't watched my other ones, because I go through a lot of sources like this on this channel, and I hope it's something you enjoy. Any observations, questions, welcome down below. Any particular requests as well, also welcome down below. Thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will of course again be next time, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.